All right, I have 101, so I guess we better get started. Welcome, everybody. This is our last Energy and Environment Forum of the semester. Don't worry, we're going to do it again next semester. We're starting to think about planning for that. I think I mentioned this last talk, but if you do have people you're interested in us pursuing to come here for the Energy Environment Forum, please let us know. We're interested in doing that. We're now putting together the list for the fall. Hopefully we'll have that finalized, by the beginning of the semester, more or less. So keep an eye out for that. Just a reminder that this forum is really meant to be an event that brings together people from lots of different disciplines who are interested in energy, environmental policy. And so we want you to get to know each other and to participate as well. I think the best way to do that is to ask questions. And so Dean, our speaker for today, has just said he really would like to have questions throughout. So if you do have questions, raise your hand. We do have people participating online, so that's why we have the microphone. So we'll try to pass the mic around just so they can hear what your questions are. And I will say, if you are participating online, please ask questions as well. You can type questions into the prompt there and send those in, and Courtney is monitoring that so she can read those out. So please speak up if anything's unclear, if you want to question some assumptions, whatever that is. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim Fitzgerald to introduce our speaker for today.
Yeah, thanks. So Dean Lueck comes to us from a basketball school that is trying to transition to football, which is Indiana University, where he is professor of economics, and he is also an affiliate faculty in the Maurer School of Law. When he first went to Indiana University, he was the founding director of the program on natural resource governance as part of the Ostrom workshop at Indiana University, which is an interesting legacy of kind of the intersection between economics and political science and how it relates to environmental and natural resource issues. His areas of research are the economics of contracts and property rights, and economic organization, law and economics, and environmental and natural resource economics. But today he's going to talk to us about wildlife, and this is part of an ongoing research effort that he's had over many years, studying how humans allocate and manage wildlife resources of a bunch of different types I think he's going to talk about. And he's also studied a whole bunch of other interesting stuff like land demarcation and wildfires. I think the wildfires interest comes from his, before he became a professional economist, he was a professional smoke jumper, jumping out of perfectly good airplanes into forest fires. And so he has some certain insight on that. And if anybody wants to talk to him about that, you can catch him afterwards. But for now, he's going to talk to us about the governance of wildlife.
Thank you, Tim. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks for having me here, and it's been nice to get to know some people. This morning we had some great conversations, including about the snail darter, which was great to talk about. What I want to do today is tell you a story, a saga, if you will, about people and wild animals from an economic perspective, which is a unique perspective that people can take on this topic. The topic is what I call governance of wildlife, an economic saga of man and beast. It's based on a book manuscript I'm working on for Cambridge University Press. I'm going to go pretty broad and not too deep. I'm going to drop in some depths on a couple different topics, including bison. And as Dale mentioned, please feel free to fire questions at me really any time. What you see here is a picture of cave painting. I think it's from Africa. I can't remember. I don't have the notes in front of me here. But if you look closely or imagine, you see people interacting with animals in various ways. There's some domesticated animals up there. There's some wild beasts and some hunting going on and so on. And this, I like this cave art as a way to think about this story of people and animals. Go back to So I'm going to throw some questions at you first. Why is this animal Rangifer tarandus, which you see in the picture, a wild animal in North America, but a domestic animal in Europe? I'll see if I can go to my link here. See how this works. So there you see the same species, and we talked about species today. I don't think there's any dispute these are the same species. On the right, you see people herding Rangifer tarandus, we call them reindeer, and they even milk them sometimes and make cheese. On the left, you see the wild caribou in Alaska. What happened to the American bison and the passenger pigeon? Both ubiquitous species in North America. Passenger pigeon are extinguished, bison nearly extinguished. How did we get these common creatures, cats, dogs, cows, goats, and pigs, from our wild ancestors? And I'm going to show you a picture of some dogs, Canis lupus, same species. Just shows what you can do if you select for short, over and over again. And another one, why are some of these once reviled predators being reintroduced into our landscapes near people? Okay. And I'm going to show you a map of, this is a map of Europe. We call it reintroduction here in North America. It's rewilding in Europe, and there you see a wolverine, a lynx, and a brown bear, and a wolf, and you see someplace on the map where they've been reintroduced. So these are some questions that might get you going. For some context, I hope this shows up okay. We'll see. I've put together this table, and it shows some key species here. Humans, and I should note here, humans used to be, if you go back a ways, I'm not going to pretend to be an anthropologist, archaeologist here, but you go back a ways, humans were one of a few primates, hunter-gatherer, omnivore primates, milling around Africa, and then now we're a different creature. We're the only one of our genus to survive. And if you look at the population, 8.2 billion versus hunter-gatherer times maybe 4 million. But I've also isolated some other species here, Canis lupus, Bos taurus, Sus scrofa. I won't get them all. And what do you notice? If you look at hunter-gatherer times, see a bunch of zeros here. No dogs, no taurine cattle, no pigs. And then you go to the modern era, and what do you see? Nearly 1 billion dogs, 225,000 wolves. I'm not going to worry about with the data. I'm off by 10, 15%. Doesn't really matter. Taurine cattle, 1.5 billion cattle. No aurochs. They went out in 1600 sometime. Wild boar, and so on. Yeah, that's 24 trillion chickens. That's a lot of chickens. Where's that billion? I can't even see. There's so many zeros. Anyway, and horses, and Atlantic salmon. Similar story. So here's the context. This has been a dramatic transformation of sort of the biological stuff over 20,000 years, let's say. How did we get here, and how can economics help us understand that? That's what I'm going to try to help you with here, and want to give you a sense of my approach to this topic, and then I'll show you the layout of the book, the outline, and we'll dip in a few places. So wildlife, it can have different perspectives here. You can think of it biologically, from a conservation, economic, or managerial perspectives even. So I'm not going to worry too much about how to define this. We're thinking about non-human animals that generally have not been domesticated. Domesticated can have biological and legal meanings. So I'm thinking about biological meanings now. They haven't been transformed. We'll talk about that a little bit. Morphologically, like we took that beautiful wolf and turned it into this little foofy toy poodle, and so on. And sometimes they're considered native. That's not necessarily true, depending on what definition you like. So that's the subject matter of my talk, my book. What's wildlife governance? It is this set of institutions and organizations, and I want to separate them for you. So institutions are going to be the rules, if you will, the laws, the norms, the contracts that tell us what you can and cannot do. And organizations are the groups of people that do these things. And it could be families, and the Eleanor Ostrom workshop sense. It could be community-based groups and so on. It could be firms, it could be nation states, it could be NGOs, etc. And these firms, these organizations and institutions together tell us who owns the wildlife, who has the property rights to the live animals and to the habitat. And it can be mixed up. It doesn't have to be in the same configuration. We'll talk about the different kinds of governance that might emerge, but I want you to think about this as the way I'm going to think about what governance means here. I have a link here. I'm not even sure it is. Let's take a look. Oh, this is kind of nice. This is a quote from a 19th century publication known as Forest and Stream, which I think is still around in something called Field and Stream. This is at a time when wildlife in the U.S., I'll show you a slide later on deer, were rapidly diminishing, and people were trying to figure out what to do. And we really hadn't created our wildlife agencies yet. We had some laws and so on. And this writer says, look, we need a law that says the fish and game on someone's land are the property of the landowner, to give them incentive to own them, okay? That's the problem here. And we'll see that, well, yeah, there's some truth to that, and there's some limitations to that thinking. So that is one potential way of governing wildlife. So here's what I'm trying to do in this book. I'm recognizing that there's this wide range of institutions and organizations that humans have used. And this history, I think it's more of a saga. It's up and down. It's not linear. It comes and goes. There's successes, failures. But from an economic perspective, there's a logic here. And I think there's a logic. I'll highlight the fourth bullet point here. Even when things appear tragic and wasteful, like the extinction of the passenger pigeon, maybe that's an example. You may have another favorite example. That this logic still helps us understand what's going on. And what we want to do about it, that's sort of your own business. And that really wildlife are kind of a fundamental piece of humanity, if you will. And I use the term time immemorial sort of to mean a long time ago, sort of to be a little bit snarky, and sort of to think that the history is a long one that deserves some understanding from this economic perspective. This is the book that I am working on, and this is what it'll be in 8 chapters, and we'll go through. We'll lay out the first couple chapters, and then we'll dabble with domestication, extermination for sure, maybe some other things as well, and then we can talk about contemporary wildlife governance as well. I've started out the book with what I call some vignettes on wildlife, which will, I think, link to that table I showed you that showed how these, and some of those questions I asked, how the same species can be governed very differently in different places and time. And so let's take a look at the wolf and the dog again to show you a picture. So Canis lupus, as a wolf, is pretty much governed by what we call wildlife law. It can't be owned generally as private property. It's sometimes hunted, protected, sometimes ignored if you're way in North Russia, let's say. It's been reintroduced recently in Colorado for the most recent one, and quite unsuccessfully by most accounts. As dogs, these things are private property. You can be bought and sold, and you're liable for damages they cause as an owner of a dog. And so there's a lot of different governance structures. Why does this make some sense? This is maybe the most interesting one, this tribe, bovini, the wild cattle. So there's 2 lines, really, the buffalo and bovines. I'll leave that. I don't know much about the Sala, and I'm sure if I pronounced that right. In this tribe, so on the top we've got, this is the wild auroch, extinct now. This is the wild Asian buffalo, still around. And then there's, I don't know, is that a red Angus or a limousine? I'm not sure. Tim, do you know? Red Angus. And then down here we've got I'm not sure, this is a humped cattle, Bos indicus, if you will. Notice what's happened here in terms of governance-wise. Well, the auroch were extinguished, okay? Some of these creatures have been domesticated and are found in huge numbers like the taurine cattle, which we lump the Taurus and Indicus together as. And then we've got the buffalo were also, the true buffaloes were domesticated and even be used to make mozzarella cheese, in case you didn't know. So that's the Asian domesticated buffalo that lives in Italy, has been there for a long time. They've been conserved. The bison have never been domesticated, nearly extinct in Europe and North America, but not completely. On the domesticated side, meat, hides, power, even worship sometimes. We've talked about reindeer, but if you look at these creatures, let's go down here and look at, let's look at the king of fish, as the Salmo salar is called, the Atlantic salmon. It's overwhelmingly produced in pen as a pen-reared fish now, and I showed you the numbers, and it's actually on the endangered species list in the United States recently, but still quite prevalent in Canada and the North Atlantic of Europe, but not even in Maine. It's on the endangered species list now. Again, as a wild animal, it's governed under wild life law and cannot be owned until captured and bought and sold and so forth. As a pen fish, it's private property, basically. Okay, and let's look at the passenger pigeon very quickly. Here, the passenger pigeon was ubiquitous in the eastern hardwoods like Tennessee, of North America. Some biologists have estimated they may have been a third of the biomass of all birds in North America. It was the bird. It went extinct. The last one, there she is, Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo around 1910 or 11, I think. And so it's gone. But is it gone? There are some biologists and other entrepreneurial dreamers that are working right now to resurrect this thing through genetic engineering, using DNA from past taxidermy samples, introducing them into eggs of related pigeons, and they're on the verge of hatching a live passenger pigeon. Okay, so there's a big movement here. I'll talk about this again. So maybe extinction is not forever. The question is this: if this is successful, what does it mean in terms of, say, the topic at hand here? But I use these vignettes just to get you to think about how governance might vary, and then get you thinking about, well, why does it vary? How does this possibly make any sense? Recognizing that the audience here is full of wildlife lovers. Okay, we're all rich Americans. We love wildlife. Okay, so keeping that in mind, here's what my introductory chapter is going to look like. I'm going to start with the premise that there was kind of an ancient hunter-gatherer equilibrium, if you will. Okay, back when we didn't have dogs, just wolves, no cattle, just aurochs, etc. And groups of humans are out there interacting with the environment, hunting, gathering, and so forth. And there's some sort of baseline population. I don't have a sweet slide for you here, at least at this point. And then we've had these massive continental transformations. That table I showed you of the populations of these various species in the wild and domesticated form, are one way to think about these continental transformations. The transformation in North America took place pretty quickly and pretty recently. So if you go back 300 years ago, it was a very different landscape: 25, 30, 40 million bison, 20, 30 million deer, the passenger pigeons, etc. That's dramatically transformed. But the deer have been transformed, but they're back. And one question is, well, how did this happen, and why did it happen? So I'm going to show you two pictures here. Look at the upper left one first. This shows deer from 1700 to 2000, lower 48, white-tailed deer and mule deer. So let's say 35 million deer. We're down to a couple million. This is hard to believe. So deer were considered regionally, they were extinct in Indiana, if you can believe that, around 1900. It's hard to believe because they're basically all over campus, they're everywhere. And now we're back up to that same 30 million. Notice how low we go and how rapidly we increase. Here's a similar timeline picture for African elephants, and maybe 25 million African elephants, and now down to, I don't know what it is, a few 100,000 or something like that. No big rebound yet, and I would suggest there's never going to be a rebound for elephants like deer. What's the difference? There is, in the end of the book, I'm going to talk about something I call the problem of dangerous beasts, and elephant is one of those. I can show you, I won't, but I have one of my RAs dig up slides like this for important species in different continents. You can find something like this for kangaroos in Australia, where they rebound. Kangaroos are really kind of deer. I mean, they're marsupials, but they're deer from an ecological perspective. I'll let the biologists challenge me or support me on that. Anyway, so you have big transformations here, and we also had transformations in governance. So let's notice what I want to summarize here. Basically what you have in 1500 or 1700, you have community-based tribal governance, hunter-gatherer governance, if you will, and you've got some equilibrium of people and deer, or people and elephants. What you've had in North America for sure is a giant transformation. The tribes are gone. Their governance mechanism of these communal areas is gone. We have demarcated the land into squares. Some of you are thinking, this sounds awful. I wish I could have lived in 1700. But remember, you would have had a life expectancy of 35 or 40 or something like that. And we have a large federal government with states and administrative agencies that now tell us what we can do with deer. So tremendous transformation in terms of the wildlife and also of the governance system. In North America, we had this decimation and recovery. In places like Africa for elephants, we've had mostly a dramatic reduction, near decimation, not extinction, though, and it begs the question of how many do you want to keep around, which is part of this study. So this is an important thing to think about. The next thing to think about is, let's think about this governance system a little more carefully and think about the range of governance, okay? This slide kind of summarizes what I just have said. This is kind of what has happened generally. If you want one slide to summarize what has happened over 20,000 years, this is it. You went from this tribal commons, hunter-gatherer equilibrium with humans and non-human wildlife, and then you transform into this modern administrative state with all sorts of mixed forms of private and state control kind of mixed in. So that's what's happened. We'll take you deeper into that in a second. So the next thing I want to talk about is more detail about the paradigm that I'm proposing here. And I want to propose to you that the way to think about governance from an economic perspective is to think about who owns the wildlife and the habitat, and whether they own them together and under what kind of regime they do. And so I want you to think a little bit about property rights. And property rights to economists means different things than it might mean to other people, especially lawyers. So as I mentioned, governance is this set of institutions and organizations that define and control the property rights. Economic rights are bigger than legal rights. Okay, legal rights are the formal state-enforced rules, and they can be important. They can be dominant, sometimes in the case of Endangered Species Act, let's say. But there were economic rights before there were modern nation states, and they were the rights enforced by the local groups. And that means that we have to think about what can people actually do? What do they actually control? I've heard stories about people taking, snail darters out of streams and throwing them in a bucket and then driving around, throwing them in another body of water. That was probably illegal, but somebody had the economic rights to be able to do that, and so because no one could enforce the legal rights, let's say. When I note here that assets have many attributes and uses, I'm thinking of the land and also these populations. So there are, the property rights are going to be imperfect. You're not going to be able to own things perfectly. People will come into a lake and maybe grab some snail darters and so forth. They will steal dogs. They will let their cattle run loose and so on. And so I want to think about both the wildlife living populations and the habitat as assets. They're complicated, and the property rights are often going to be, almost certainly going to be imperfect. And often because we have very large landscapes at issue, they become even more imperfect than we might otherwise think. So that's kind of my approach to thinking about this. I'm going to show you a table now, which is a way to summarize this, and I'll try to talk about some of these cases here. So this table shows you a bunch of cells where we have different, can you see if I can make a pointer here, can I? There we go, this is better. So on top here, we have governance regimes for habitat, land, or it could be aquatic habitat too. And then the populations here. And I'm considering basically, this simplifies of course, but we have to model at some point. I'm considering basically 4 kind of property regimes. Open access, no one owns anything. No one can keep anybody out. Common property, it's a group, a well-defined group that will enforce and try to keep people out. Private property, you know what that is. State property. State property can include this room owned by the state of Tennessee. It can include a fighter jet. In Montana, where I spent a lot of time hiking national forest land, I sometimes see people wearing a t-shirt that says, "I'm a public property owner," which is sort of true as a, if you're a citizen of the United States anyway, and it's federally owned land. But, I've been tempted to get a t-shirt that says, "I'm a fighter jet owner," okay? Because I'm a taxpayer and I own a fighter jet. And that doesn't mean I can go jump in my fighter jet anytime I want. In fact, I couldn't get near one. So state property is very complicated. It's governed by administrative rules. Sometimes state property means you can go hike out there whenever you want. Sometimes it means you can't go anywhere near a fighter jet no matter what you want, and so on. So habitat in principle could be owned in any of these categories. Okay. Similarly, so could the population of bison, let's say, could be open access. Now, one thing I'm not doing here, I'm not considering property rights across other species, like grizzly bears versus the bison, or wolves versus the bison, and so forth. That's a topic for pure biology, and so I'm just thinking of property rights from the Homo sapiens perspective. So let's take a look at what this means here. So open access for the habitat and the population would be kind of the simplest case you can imagine. Disorganized group, hunting whenever they wanted. There's no tribal leader to say, hey, you can't hunt today. There's no chief. Nobody owns the land or the species, okay? Our hunter-gatherers, that my ancient equilibrium scenario I was talking about here, I would put them here, where you've got common property in the land, the habitat, owned by the group, say the Lakota people on the plains of North America, and they jointly, in common, own the bison on their territory, and they keep other people out. They try to keep the whites out, they try to keep the crow out, and so forth. Okay, this is kind of the starting point for the, I should have highlighted that actually. Maybe I'll highlight it right now. There it is. That's kind of the starting point. A typical modern livestock ranch setting would be right here. I've got my private cattle, they're branded, they're tagged, and so forth, and on my private piece of range. Now, no, I could do this also. I could cancel that, and I could put bison in there. Turns out there's 300,000 private bison in the United States. Some of them are in Tennessee that are owned privately and on private land. There's a lot of other things we might think about here. So wildlife in Yellowstone, for example, if I can find my marker here. There you'd have state-owned. Owned is a little tricky here, but we'll go with it. The bison are owned by the federal government on land owned by the federal government. I did some hiking in Norway a few years ago in a national park, which, by the way, is private property. It's just zoned for certain uses and then labeled a national park. And when I was there, I met with some reindeer herders, not Sami, but real Norwegians, and they had a herd of reindeer grazing in this national park on the private land, and they had a lease with the private landowner to graze their reindeer. So that is a different governance system. There were also wild reindeer in the park, kind of unowned reindeer in that same park. All right. This is another important historically. So here we have private land, private habitat, but then the wild species are essentially unowned on that private habitat. Okay. That's what was going on when that deer population plummeted from 35 million to, mostly what was going on, from 35 million to a couple million by 1900, let's say. So you can have open access to the wildlife, even though you have private land. And so this, the book is basically explaining, purports to explain, is working to explain why you end up in one of these categories in certain places and certain times. I haven't filled out examples. I'm not sure I could think of examples for all of these particular cases, but maybe we could. But that is the framework I want to propose here. Again, if you have questions about this, I know not everybody thinks about property regimes quite this way. Most of you are schooled and you've heard the term the tragedy of the commons from the famous paper by Garrett Hardin. What Hardin meant, he should have retitled it, should have been the tragedy of open access. Yes? Blanks means I haven't come with an example. If you have one?
Yes, I wanted to ask you about private land and the habitat, and then the stock being state property, because that would seem to describe.
Which one? Where are we?
So go to the bottom right and then go up one cell. Bottom right, where you've got wildlife and national parks, up one cell.
Okay.
That would seem to describe a lot of species in the U.S. whereby they're on private land, but for example, the definition of a take under the ESA, they're actually, if anything, state property.
Yeah, I take your point. I can sort of agree with that. I'll tell you why I don't completely agree with it. Wildlife under wildlife law are really sort of unowned. I mean, so they're not really state property in the sense that the state owns a F-16 fighter jet because they can't be bought and sold. There's no liability for wildlife by the state owner. In fact, the Supreme Court, this is probably considered blasphemy among wildlife managers, but the Supreme Court in 1976 said the state ownership doctrine is hereby rejected officially, finally. States do not own wildlife. They have a strong regulatory interest. So from an economic property rights perspective, the states have a strong property interest. So that's why, I don't know what I'll just put an X here for Dean needs to think about this more carefully to articulate it. But I think that's probably the best place to put that scenario of deer today that are on private land, because they're not really open access either, because you've got this regulatory mechanism. So I think fair enough. That's a good call. I mean, anyway, was there? Did you want to respond to that?
Just to jump on Paul's point.
Yeah.
Paul uses the example of a species that's protected under the ESA, and I would actually think about it as your deer example, where the state reserves control of the deer example that live on private land, and the state can then transfer the right to harvest one of those to a private individual in the form of a deer permit.
Yeah.
And someone can go out and hunt that state-owned property so long as they have a valid license. And then I think those are actually two different cases that are worthy of consideration.
Yeah, those are, I mean, even in the case of the federal, it's an endangered species, the federal government has control, but they don't have ownership I mean, they have some economic rights. I mean, I think what has to be done here is Dean needs to add another. He's got to be careful about the categories here, maybe a little bit, because those are important. I mean, that's an important real-world case: wild deer on private land or a wild endangered species on private land. And it's not. The problem is that that's why even when I went down here to Yellowstone, anyway.
Where do you put cattle owners grazing on public lands? Like, this is a big thing in the U.S., right?
Let's see, private stock on state. Wait a second.
State
here.
land?
Oh, you got to be in the third column. It's private property. It's branded.
Oh, there we are, right here. Private. Yeah, right here.
Right in the bottom, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be ranching on BLM land, let's say. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I hadn't filled out my box yet, and I need to do that more. And the questions. I mean, you'll see when I talk. If I get that far, if I talk about law, you'll see why I'm hesitant to call deer on private land in Tennessee state deer. So maybe we need to add fine tune this box a little bit. But this gives you, I hope. Any questions about this? I mean, this is kind of fundamental to the approach I'm taking. And the question is, what I'm trying to do in the book ultimately is, for the cases I examine, fit them back in here and then tell you why it makes sense that they're there, why the economic logic would put them there, and so forth. Okay. Yeah, those are great points. Thank you. I have trouble with this pointer in class too, so I haven't learned. Let me illuminate this maybe a little bit better. So imagine a simple world here. This is a schematic I like to use. So I've got the outer rectangle is just a big chunk of habitat, we'll say land. And then that dashed oval is the habitat for a population, a well-defined population. I'm not saying the populations travel in ovals or anything like that. And then around that is a larger, slightly larger rectangle that is a chunk of property owned by one party. And we can think about it as, Ted Turner, a big landowner. We can think about it maybe as a tribe, the Fitzgerald tribe, if you will. In this kind of a world where the habitat is solely encompassed by one owner, that's easy. The owner has fully gains the benefits and costs of the resource and should be able to optimally manage, harvest or not harvest, whatever it is. And there's no real problem here. It's sort of like having a mouse in your house, no problem. You take care of it or not. It's up to you. Okay? What if the world's like this? Okay? I've got the same big chunk of land, got the same habitat requirements for the species, but now I'm not going to count up those little squares, but there's a lot of them, and that stuff's moving around. And so on any given time, the animal could be here. Think back to that quote about the guy who said, let's just have the guy who's got the deer on his land own it. Okay, well, the problem is the deer is only here some of the time and it goes there. There's every incentive for each landowner to kill or take or harvest before the next guy does. So from the perspective of the wildlife, this big area here, let me get my pointer out again. The wildlife is essentially open access, even though the land might be perfectly private for the purposes of houses, buildings, and crops. This characterizes the U.S. in many places, say in the 1800s. We had these wide-ranging species going across a lot of landscapes. It also turns out in the U.S., in most jurisdictions, there was no rule against trespassing for fish and game, even on private land in the 19th century. And so you have private land, but open access for the wildlife part of it. By the way, for the natural resource econ people in here, that same picture works if the red stuff is underground water or underground oil. There's an incentive to overexploit. And now you think about urban areas, which are by definition lots of tiny parcels, Now you think about deer, which you need more than just your land, your house, your backyard. You've got a problem. But you have the state now involved, and so it's not open access. It can even get more complicated. There's more possible scenarios. This last one here is sort of interesting. I'll go to the highlighter. So here's a case where there's our wildlife territory right there, and here we've got a bunch of private landowners, okay, who individually would have incentive to take the game as open access, over harvest, if you will. And then over here we have public property, okay. It turns out this little picture describes the Mountain West often. So the public property, say national forest land, is a place generally higher altitude, higher elevation, more summer range, where the animals are for part of the year. And then in the winter months, they come down onto private property where they can cause a lot of damage, eating crops and hay and so forth. Okay. The hunting season, which is something they could potentially benefit from by restricting access, takes place during the season when the animals are off the property in higher elevation. And so they can't capture these potential benefits. You can adjust the hunting seasons, which is kind of what happens. And so this interplay between the land ownership and the habitat requirements of the species is crucial to understand what's going on. This world right here, that's the hunter-gatherer equilibrium starting point for the whole kind of book that we have defined. We are a bison hunting culture. This is what we do. We are the salmon fishing culture. We fish in this drainage or whatever it is, and so everything is fine. Then we get civilization, and we chop the land up for agriculture, and we generate a lot of wealth, population grows, etc., but it has implications for governing wildlife. So this little schematic is a way to think about these things. Let's move ahead. Let's talk a little bit about domestication. Tim, where am I with time, roughly speaking? 30 minutes, okay. I'm doing almost as good as I thought I would. So domestication. I characterize domestication as this process by which humans basically created ownership and then developed markets for animals and their products. Okay. Again, starting from this hunter-gatherer equilibrium, this all really happens. I mean, not all of it, but almost all of it. The steppes of Eurasia. And you can see all the stuff you think about as domestic comes out of here. Yeah, we had some alpaca from the vicuña. I can't even tell what this one is. That's the sweet potato, and we had turkey, and so on. But basically, it all happens here. And you can see the timetable of the years. 10,000 years ago or so, you get the sheep, goat, pigs. The dog comes first. I would argue, and my co-author would argue, that it made sense for the dog to come first because it became the tool for domesticating everything else. So the dog is a wolf, remember, and the wolf is a predator. And if I show you a picture of some wolves that are around wild caribou, and then a picture of a herding dog around reindeer, boy, it looks kind of similar. Okay, a dog is kind of a specialized hunter that doesn't kill the animal, but keeps them around for you when you need to kill them, if you will. So this process starts here, and it spreads. How did this happen? How many of you have seen this book? Maybe nobody. It's written by a biologist, two biologists, Lee Dugatton, he's at University of Louisville, then Ludmila Trut, who's Russian. I'm not sure she's still alive, but she was involved in this experiment in Soviet Russia that began in the 50s. And the idea was, we want to figure out the genetics and the biology of domesticating animals. And these biologists got the Soviet government to let them do an experiment on Silver Fox Farm, which was used to to raise money for the Soviet regime. And what they did, they started to select silver fox puppies for their friendliness toward humans. So they'd get a batch of puppies, fox pups, and they would have a little checklist. The ones that snuggled and came around, didn't bite, they kept and bred. 40 years later, they've got dogs, or something close to dogs. Remember, foxes were not the ones that people picked, but foxes were available for an experiment and wolves weren't, and so forth. And they observed all the classic domestic characteristics, which are summarized here. Basically, the retention of juvenile characteristics or neoteny. The color changes, keep all the puppy stuff, the short floppy ears and all the stuff. The brain size shrinks, by the way. Sometimes I put up a slide of hunter-gatherer humans, and then I put a slide up of a hipster, which is a modern human, and suggest that these guys have been domesticated. You get the color variations. You lose the breeding cycle. You lose the natural breeding cycle. So, and this is great if you're raising chickens for eggs and stuff like this. So this happens, and this is, notice what they did. They basically selected these animals which were nice, and nice animals are easy to control. From an economic perspective, that means they're less costly to manage, okay? And we all, if you've been around anybody who has livestock, if you've got the nasty bull or cow, you just get rid of it. What does getting rid of it mean? It goes to slaughter, and you don't let that breed anymore. You don't want to keep that line going, okay? Now, there are the exceptions. You might want to breed for hostility, for specialized things like dog fighting and cockfighting and bullfighting, okay? That's the secondary issue. And so over time, as you select for docile individuals, you get a population that's has morphologically, although still genetically the same species, and quite different. And they behave quite differently. If domesticated animals are let loose, we call them feral animals, and they behave quite differently. The biologists have studied wild reindeer versus privately owned reindeer versus feral reindeer, and they behave quite differently. The flight-fight response is muted, etc. And so what happens here, this is the kind of the key point, domestication basically converts these wild animals into private property, and then people have incentive to invest in them, they have incentive to buy and sell them, and so forth. And the early rise of law coincides with domestication of animals. In fact, the English word chattel comes from cattle. It means, chattel in law means personal property. And so this is, you don't really get the kind of strong private property in animals and or land until you get domestication. Okay, and so we think of this as the kind of the seeds of what we think of, take for granted as kind of our mainstream private property regime that goes way back. So, part of this chapter will discuss the linkage between these ancient rules of property and land and things that goes back to domestic animals. So you start getting fences, you start getting branding and all this stuff which you don't need you can't have with wild animals. Okay, what's next? Let's talk about extermination. I call this chapter Markets Without Ownership. And so there's a lot of economics out here, a lot of theoretical stuff and some empirical things. I just kind of want to summarize my approach here. So the idea of this chapter is to explain when you get extinction and when you don't. And there's some big things to think about here. We've talked about the bison and the passenger pigeons. So I'll get to those in a sense. The basic idea is pretty straightforward. If you go back to that picture I had where you had this big territory of species and you got all sorts of people with little land holdings that have access to it, let's say, so it's kind of open access. And then you throw a market in there where there's value to be had from killing these animals and selling the bison, say, for hide, or killing the pigeons and selling them for meat or feathers. there can be great incentive to go harvest these things compared to a world in which you'd only harvest a passenger pigeon for your own, food and clothing, let's say. And so expansion of these markets without ownership of the wild population can be bad news. And that can be bad news for bison, passenger pigeons. It might be bad news for elephants and rhino even. That's a current discussion. And so the general cause, I think, is pretty straightforward. You have open access to the stocks, that means no ownership of them, and extensive markets for their products. Okay, and the overharvest can drive those populations to zero. It could be locally, like no more deer in Indiana, or regionally, or it could be completely, which happened with the passenger pigeon. You can also get habitat destruction, and I haven't talked about that much. That would be conversion of that underlying habitat. So Indiana was originally forest land, and now it's all, I shouldn't say all, the northern 2/3 is all corn and soybean land, basically. So that's been converted, and that's, different kind of habitat. Probably what happened, and I'll show you a slide in a second, is that for passenger pigeons, you had this and this. You changed the habitat, you got rid of the hardwood forest, at least the contiguous hardwood forest, and you had tremendous overharvest under open access with widespread markets. In that time in the United States, in the late 1900s, you had widespread markets for game in all the major cities, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Cincinnati, you name it, and so forth. So what can make it happen? You need open access to the habitat, and also you need high costs of creating property rights. The thing about the market, if there's value for these passenger pigeons, you might think, boy, I could make a killing, literally, if I could own these passenger pigeons and then decide when to harvest them optimally. The problem is what? Take that little picture, and it's not just a square of little landowners, it's all the landowners on the East Coast up into Canada. So that's a hard problem to solve in terms of organizing and coordinating that many landowners. If you have low costs of killing, well, what happens in the 19th century in the US? This is why the US is quite different from Europe. Europe, you have a similar process, but it takes place over centuries, millennia, really. You now have weapons, modern rifles, and you can kill things pretty cheaply. You couldn't kill things that cheaply in Roman England, for example. And you also have increased value of the habitat for alternative uses. So we can use this passenger pigeon habitat for growing corn and soybeans and wheat and so forth, and that makes it worthwhile to alter the habitat. Okay, let's take a look. This is kind of how I've summarized North America. And I look at three bison, beaver, and birds. I really mean passenger pigeons here, kind of, but got the three Bs, so some alliteration doesn't hurt. So bison, what happened? Bison was really no habitat loss, just open access, and you had pretty much one-for-one replacement with cattle on the Great Plains. And there was a market, and a big market emerged for hides in the late around 1870, and it didn't take long to wipe these guys out. I'm going to skip beaver for a second. So birds, say passenger pigeons, yeah, you had open access, big market for fur, for meat and feathers and so forth, and you had tremendous habitat loss, at least for some species. The beaver, okay, the beaver don't range that widely, and so early on there was a booming trade with indigenous peoples and European traders where the natives would harvest the beaver and sell to the European traders, and that actually went on for a long time. And so you didn't have open access initially, you didn't have habitat loss, and you had market goods. Later you get open access, and this history is something I don't understand completely, but basically the tribal property regimes get broken down. Probably habitat loss occurred in some places, but that wasn't really the driving thing, just again, a later overharvest, and so you get not complete extinction of beaver, but local extinctions and some regional stuff. In Europe and Asia, I'm trying to learn more about China, which is hard. My sense is that in China, wildlife got wiped out much earlier, and there's not that much concern about it even today, that this happened, that this conversion the conversion, the big transformation is considered good, essentially. In Europe, you get the bison on the continent wiped out a couple thousand years ago, more or less. Pockets in Eastern Europe, and there's still some in Poland. The wolves get wiped out early on, but it's a slow process. Remember, you're hunting before firearms for most of that period. All the big stuff gets wiped out. And I want to pose a question, especially for the biology types here, because you often see this. I'm just kind of using you, if you will. You often see this argument that we've got to get these large predators back into ecosystems because the ecosystems just won't function right, and it's critical for human survival to have these large predators back. I think the evidence suggests that doesn't matter, at least to humans. I mean, it may matter for human survival. That is, you don't need brown bears or grizzly bears on the landscape for the ecosystems to survive in some fundamental sense. You may want them back for other reasons, for aesthetic reasons or other biodiversity reasons, things like this. But it's often suggested that removing these large apex species is almost like having a toxic spell of some chemical, and it's destroying the environment at that fundamental level. I don't think that's what the evidence suggests here. The big species, the big dangerous stuff, has been knocked out of Europe and Asia for a long, long time, and remains really only in these isolated pockets that basically are, by definition, if you will, not worth pursuing. It's not worth pursuing wolves and bears in northern Siberia. We're just going to leave them alone, if you will. And also notice what happens here. In Europe and Asia, there's no real administrative state. There's Roman Empire, there's Chinese empires, but those things don't really emerge until the fauna have really changed. And so the paths are quite different. This is something I want to explain more as the book develops. Africa is more like North America in terms of time. You don't get the big impact until the recent period. You get open access, you get the big markets, and you get low cost of hunting with modern technology. Australia is like that as well, and so on. Let's go back. Okay, we're doing good. I want to get to bison. That's one of my, I promised people I'd get to that. So formal law is formal rules to govern wildlife. So law emerges, 7,000, 8,000 years ago in Mesopotamia somewhere. It's linked to agriculture and so on. In the United States, we followed English law. English law, in a quick summary, basically gave wildlife by the end of the 19th century to the landowners, actually. Not completely, but most of the property rights, economic property rights, went to the landowners. They could determine who hunted and when, and they actually kept the game after it was killed. So the market for wildlife in Europe and in England still thrives, actually. Completely different than the U.S. The U.S. basically does not allow the sale of wild game. So personal consumption only if you harvest a wild animal. In the United States, we got these state game departments. I'm viewing these game departments basically as the solution to the problem of having all these little landowners and wide-ranging species. If you can't get the landowners together to manage to stop the open access problem, you need some sort of police. And that's kind of the way I think about it. This is a hard graph to realize because I've got a bunch of agencies here, but I'll highlight it for you. Get the red one out here. So this basically shows the creation of state wildlife agencies. It happens in the late 1800s and it's pretty much over by early 1900s. And in a co-author, we've done some statistical analysis. We basically find that the states that had, to summarize a lot of stuff, the states that had the most severe problem of little holdings and big landscapes went for the state game department first to solve this problem. So the state agency is viewed as wildlife police, a way to get some ownership on these animals that are roaming around a bunch of private parcels that would otherwise have been treated as open access and over-harvested. Okay. Now notice when this happens. It happens, if you think back to the deer chart, it happens when the deer are bottoming out, basically. And notice what happens later, the deer are back. So these agencies do a couple things. Early on, they just kind of limit the open access harvest. And then later meaning 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they're involved in reintroductions. Not illegal ones like the snail darter, but the state of Idaho would round up some deer and sell them to Indiana and drop them off in the woods of Indiana, and then now you know how many, now there's a lot of deer in Indiana and so forth. So this is the way we're thinking about this, and our analysis shows the following sort of relationship. Those other lines you see are the formation of other agencies, which are not really relevant. I need to fix up this table here. And so that's how we think of state agencies in this wildlife context. I also think of things like the EPA or the state water department as kind of air and water police, if you will. That's similar analysis. Okay. Let's talk about federalism. Well, not yet. Let's talk about bison. Okay. Bison are, I'm saying, tangled in law. So here's a quick summary here, and I'll tell you about the figures in a second. But bison, let's say 25 million in 1700. That's probably a low number. Maybe that's just the Great Plains. By 1900 or 1890, I can't remember when we did the final count. William Hornaday, the geologist for the taxidermist for the Smithsonian Institution. I think that position has been abolished by Doge actually now. But he went out on an expedition to get samples so they could have a bison in the collection. And so he heads out and killed a bunch of bison for his collection. And then he further realized, man, there aren't many bison left. And then he did a big survey, and you're down to almost 1,000. I can't remember the exact number, but it's 987. But he had an exact number. That's not very many from 25 million. Now we have 400,000, almost all private. Take a look at this picture. Notice what happens in here. Private bison, and that's probably the data points. You see there are not a lot of data points here, but the blue are conservation herds like Yellowstone Park, Wind Cave National Park, Wichita Mountains, all these places. We've got 40,000 bison in those parks. We've had that for quite a while now. The private herds grew dramatically in the latter part of the 20th century. And notice also what happened over here. States started categorizing bison as domestic animals, which means you could own them, buy and sell their products, and so forth. This information is part of a research project trying to figure out what happened here and why. And we don't have the final answer yet, but I'll tell you what seems to be true. During this period, you have these public parks that are created. Yellowstone gets more, but Yellowstone didn't have many bison early 1900s. They got a few more from some private herds. Around the turn of the century, while there was only 1,000 bison left, where were these? These were in the hands of a few kind of esoteric, eclectic, nutty ranchers in Texas, Colorado, Montana, South Dakota that had just rounded up some bison back in the good old days. And they had them roaming around out there, and they were actually buying and selling them locally as chattel, private property, like dogs and horses and stuff. States weren't very well formed. And you get some lobbying by the American Bison Society to create these parks. And so you buy some of these bison, you send them to Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma, Wind Cave, Fort Niobrara, and all sorts of places. And these places are all fenced to protect their bison. They're trying to preserve them, so they didn't want them wandering off, which is what bison would do. And by 1950 or so, all of these places are full. They're at carrying capacity, and they start selling bison and slaughtering bison and giving bison away. And so there's the development of these private herds. It seems, and I'm just going to say the conjecture at this point, no evidence really to support it clearly, that there became a demand from the private sector to have these private bison categorized like cattle so we can fully integrate into a market with standard practices of buying and selling, weighing, controlling for diseases and so forth. And so you get this bison law changing. Now, this little table up here shows the differences in law between, and this maybe goes back to your question earlier about where should we put the deer that are state property here, if you will. So under wildlife law, nobody really owns the wildlife alive, including the state. Ownership only after harvest under state regulations. That's all very true. There's no liability for damage. So if the deer populations explode, there's no liability for damage in law. There might be liability for damage under some statutes, and there is in many cases in many states programs that emerge, including, say, Montana. You can't transfer the animals or the products. Okay, under domestic law, it's very different. You own the animals, you can buy and sell, you have liability for damage and all of these things. And so under these incentives, the populations of bison have grown dramatically. Now, what exactly do these bison look like? Some of them are in large landscapes, 20,000-acre ranches, in big herds, some owned by private profit-seeking parties, some owned by NGOs, and sometimes some guys have 5 acres and they're feeding a couple bison with some hay bales, okay? And so what a lot of biologists, conservation types are concerned about is that, you know, there's this selection process. There's this how to tame a fox process maybe going on with bison, and we're going to convert them into domestic because if we're trying to handle bison in a small area, we want to make sure they're nice. And that means we don't want the old nice, in quotes here. We don't want them, we don't want, put it another way, we don't want 20-year-old males in a bison herd that we're trying to manage because they're uncontrollable. We want to get rid of the old. This is also true of old males in the academy. We try to get rid of them as well. And so if you look at, and we're doing that here, if you look at the sex age distribution of these private herds, they're very different than the Yellowstone herd. So private owners do not keep bulls until they're 20. They get rid of them by age 5 or 6. They keep a much higher ratio of females to males than you would find in a natural population. It's not like cattle ranching, but it's kind of in that direction in a small way. So the law, the governance system will matter in terms of what you get. But notice what you've got here. You've got a lot of bison. So that's arguably a good thing if you're interested in that. If you're interested in bison conservation, let's see if we can get rid of this. Go back. I want to show you this before I quit because I think this is good. So some of you know about this. So this is a map of North America. It shows biological flyways for migratory waterfowl. And now talk about an example of a hard to govern thing. You've got populations of, say, geese or ducks and other water birds that live part of the year in Central America, part of the year in various states in the U.S., and then in various provinces in Canada. That's a lot of landowners you need to organize to control that population from being overhunted, which they were. And so how do you handle that? Well, here's what we've done. We have created these state agencies, which give states authority, not ownership fully, but authority to regulate within state borders. And then we have treaties between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and then even some other Central American countries to organize the states and their agencies. And notice what we've done. We've created these administrative flyways, which are a way to give some sort of property rights that links to the habitat. Now, that's not perfect by any means. But the alternative was what? Killing ducks whenever they flew over your piece of land, and we know what happened there. So this is a pretty interesting governance regime, if you will. I will say just a couple words about species conservation. I want to do a big historical chapter here. And the difference between conservation, and you can think about non-game wildlife this way too. The nice thing about the wildlife that have products is there's something you can sell. You can buy and sell stuff. That means you can get a return on protecting the animals. For non-game animals, it's harder for landowners, whether they be state or federal, to capture the benefits of that because it's sort of a public good. And so that makes it a particularly tricky problem. One thing I'm learning as the research for the book goes forward, you'll see point B here, indigenous reverence. You often find, and again, my knowledge on this is very thin, so don't hold me to anything here. You do find indigenous peoples having reverence for certain species and sort of honoring them and protecting them in their tribal cultures, if you will. That may be the first sort of governance regime, if you will, for conservation purposes, and I don't know much about it. You also find, I like at least the working title of this section, Kings, Tyrants, and Spiritual Leaders. Kings often had royal preserves that they kept to themselves for their hunting preserves, often to the detriment of the peasants, by the way. This is standard operating procedure. It's actually not that uncommon to what happened as the United States created national parks where they got rid of the locals, some native, some European colonist locals. And then of course there are spiritual leaders out there as well in some parts of the world. One of my favorite examples of this kind of preservation is Nicolae Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator, who was even by some, even regarded by some U.S. environmental organizations as a great conservationist, as he murdered his people to create preserves in the Carpathian Mountains for brown bears. Okay, so this is a governance regime, whether you like it or not. It's there. A big thing that happened in North America for sure, and it's a debate that's happening in Africa now, was restricting the market. That is, limiting the market when you had this open access condition as a way of conserving species, taking away the incentive to kill animals. This happened in the United States around 1900 with the passage of state laws and then the Lacey Act as well. Europe never went this way. Europe basically let the private landowners have more rights and allowed the market to flourish. Okay, and here's the issue: if you can do that simultaneously, it can work nicely. If you can't get the property rights established before the market creates the incentive to overharvest too much, you may end up wiping out species. This is kind of the debate in Africa between southern African countries and East Africa. So southern African countries want the market for rhino horn and other wild species as a way to give incentive for private parties to husband them and protect them. And it sort of works. In Kenya, it's the opposite. They do everything they can to ban wildlife trade, and they really don't allow private action, private property in wildlife. And so it's kind of an empirical question which works best. I'll talk about some modern stuff in the final chapter. I'm going to wrap up here. I do want to say one thing before I do. I'm working on an epilogue, which is not that urgent yet since the book isn't done. But I will want to talk about resurrection biology. And there are companies out here and institutes, organizations, NGOs, and so forth that are working on this right now. And there's a lot of genetic material out there, from ice, to frozen mastodon, etc., all sorts of taxidermy samples in some cases, to work with. And so it's hard to imagine that this won't happen. Maybe not in my lifetime, but probably in many of yours. And then the question is, okay, so you have created a passenger pigeon. Now, creating a passenger pigeon and creating a flock of passenger pigeons that behaves like passenger pigeons back in the day, that's another question. But whose are those, by the way? Are they the innovator, the patent, what are the property rights? Can they be bought? Anyway, there's lots of questions there. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? That's also a good question. It will probably be some sort of thing, maybe sooner than you think. I encourage you to maybe dig into that if you find it interesting. I think I'll stop here and just, I'll just put these questions back up here for you. And the hope is I've given you kind of a teaser of what this book will be like, and a feel for the framework of analysis to try to answer these and other related questions. A lot more questions that could be discussed, and I'll leave it at that because we still have a few minutes left, I think. Yeah, thank you. Happy to take anything.
We might have time for maybe one question, but then
I went too long. I apologize.
yeah, but people can stick around and we can.
I'm not going anywhere, at least not till tomorrow. So.
Go ahead and ask a question before we break up.
So if they won't ask questions, Dean, I will ask questions.
Yeah, good. Good.
So I'm going to take the bison example.
Yeah.
And this idea about classifying as domestic versus wild. Right, so Montana, American Prairie,
Yes.
2022, the Biden administration lets them graze bison on BLM land where they've got primarily conservation aims. 26, the Trump administration revokes that permission, so they're now they're managing a bison herd, but they're being told they cannot graze the bison herd on BLM land.
No.
Not because anything genetic or behavioral changed about bison, but rather because of the intent that they had in managing the herd, because it was not for commercial uses. So it seems to me that this classification of domestic versus wild, a lot of it's actually about how we intend the species to be sort of used or managed in the landscape.
Yeah, so that's an interesting case. So let me kind of update everybody on this a little bit. Thank you for that question. So American Prairie is an NGO. They have bought up a lot of private land in northern Montana and put bison on it, and it's considered a conservation success from that perspective. Notice they couldn't have done this without having the bison as domesticated animals under the law. That doesn't mean the bison are domesticated. And so they were able to use the private market to stock bison, and they did that. It turns out that in that part of the world there's a lot of federal land, the Bureau of Land Management land, which can be used for livestock grazing, and it had been used for cattle until the American Prairie bought this land, and they wanted to convert those leases to leases for bison, which, by the way, has been done in other parts of the United States on BLM land before them. In Colorado and Wyoming, it's quite common, actually. The American Prairie has been politically on the wrong side of the aisle with the Republican administration, and the situation he described took place. Their permit to lease the land for bison was revoked. I want to say this, having dug into this and talked to people who know more about it, the Bureau of Land Management did a big review of all of the bison leases and other leases as well. It turns out that the law that created the BLM, the Taylor Grazing Act, does require that the land be used for livestock for food production purposes. American Prairie explicitly says they're not in the food production business, we're in the conservation business. It also, that food production stuff also means that the stocking rates have to be a certain level, okay? And American Prairie had much lower stocking rates on its bison land than the bison guys in Wyoming or Colorado have. So American Prairie was the only, as far as I know, the only bison BLM lessee to lose its license under this review. It has become political on both sides for various reasons, but that's the notion. So I guess what I'm saying is under the law of the Taylor Grazing Act and its interpretation over 100 years, it's probably fair enough to say, yeah, they should have their lease revoked. Could American Prairie just increase the stocking rate, add more bison, and satisfy the BLM? Because the reason I say that that's potentially possible is that stocking rates on other BLM leases for bison are higher. I mean, Tim may want to weigh in on this and may know more on that. No? Don't want to go near it. So I'm not sure, I'm trying to think, did I answer your question at all? So remember, if the bison were wild, they couldn't have done any of this. Keep that in mind. Were they unfairly singled out? Maybe. Maybe not. Could they have adjusted their behavior to not be singled out? Maybe, maybe not also. It probably won't have much impact on American prairie in the long haul, but I don't know. But there are a lot of bison on public land already. Well, let's talk about that more. Tim doesn't want to weigh in on this? Not since it's not while it's being recorded. But you're not running for Congress. Anything? I'm sorry, I've taken you over time. So